The desert stretched out before him, a vast and desolate expanse under a moonless sky. The soldier's name was Corporal Ray Torres, a man of few words, hardened by years of service. The night was his companion, the cold wind whispering secrets through the cracked windows of his Humvee. This was supposed to be a routine patrol. The headlights of the vehicle cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but miles of sand and rock. Torres let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his eyes scanning the horizon. The radio crackled with static. The usual chatter from the base strangely absent. He was alone, truly alone, out in the desert where shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, only to vanish when he tried to focus on them. Then he saw it. A figure standing still as a statue in the distance, a silhouette against the starless sky, too far to make out any details, but undeniably human-shaped. His heart thudded in his chest, a deep, steady drumbeat that drowned out the sound of the engine. He slowed the Humvee, the tires crunching against the gritty earth, and squinted into the darkness. The figure didn't move. Something about the figure held him in place. It was the stillness, the unnatural stillness of it, as though it weren't a person at all, but a thing pretending to be human. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he shifted the vehicle into park, leaving the engine idling as he reached for his flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, but the figure was gone. Torres frowned, stepping out of the vehicle, boots sinking into the cold sand. The flashlight's beam swept across the empty desert. No tracks, no signs of movement, just silence and that faint, lingering scent of something foul like meat, left too long in the sun. His nose wrinkled, and he instinctively reached for the sidearm holstered at his hip. "You're tired," he thought, shaking his head. "It's just shadows and exhaustion." But the unease clung to him, heavy as the night air. When he turned back to the Humvee, the engine sputtered once, twice, then died, leaving him in utter darkness. He cursed under his breath, yanking open the door and sliding back into the driver's seat. He turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. The radio, too, was dead, as if the vehicle had suddenly lost all power. He smacked the dashboard, frustration creeping into his veins. Great, he thought, his mind racing through possible solutions. The base wasn't too far, maybe a couple of miles. He could hike it back, report the vehicle malfunction, and this eerie patrol would be over. He didn't have much choice. Torres grabbed his gear, slipping a flashlight into his belt and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. The desert was a harsh mistress at night, the cold biting through his uniform as he began the trek back to the base. Each step crunched loudly in the stillness, the sound amplified by the emptiness around him. Minutes passed, and the sense of being watched grew, a creeping sensation that crawled along his spine. He stopped, listening. Nothing but the wind, whistling softly through the rocks and dry brush. Yet, there was something else, just on the edge of hearing. A whisper, faint and almost imperceptible. It wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too intentional. He strained to listen, his heart hammering in his chest. The whisper grew clearer, words forming in the dark. It was his voice. No, not exactly his, but close enough. A grotesque imitation, mocking him in the silence.
"You're tired,"
it said, the words dripping with malice.
"It's just shadows and exhaustion."
Torres froze, every muscle in his body tensing as his breath hitched in his throat. His eyes darted around, searching for the source. But there was nothing. No movement. No figure in the distance. Just the endless desert and the voice in his head. "It's not real," he told himself, forcing his legs to move again. "It's just the wind, or maybe you're more tired than you thought. Keep moving." But the voice didn't stop. It echoed his thoughts, twisting them into something dark and sinister.
"You're not alone,"
it whispered, a shiver running down his spine. The temperature dropped suddenly, the chill biting into his skin despite the layers of clothing. His breath fogged in the air, visible even in the weak moonlight. He gripped his rifle tighter, the metal cold against his gloved hands, as he picked up the pace. The base couldn't be far now. but each step felt heavier, the distance stretching impossibly before him. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the whispering, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. He glanced over his shoulder, the flashlight beam catching nothing but darkness. Yet, he knew that he wasn't alone. The desert, once a place of emptiness, now felt alive, teeming with unseen eyes and unspeakable horrors. Torres clenched his jaw, forcing his feet to keep moving, to carry him through the darkness and the cold. The voice was louder now, echoing around him, bouncing off the unseen walls of the night.
You're close.
It hissed, the words slithering into his mind.
So close. But not close enough.
A shape moved in the corner of his vision, a fleeting glimpse of something too quick to be human. His breath caught in his throat as he turned, rifle raised, finger hovering over the trigger. The flashlight beam wavered, illuminating nothing but rocks and sand. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the voice in his head. It's just shadows, he told himself again, but the words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what he was experiencing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse, more oppressive, as if the very air had been sucked out of the night. Torres stood there, rifle still raised, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the desert was silent once more. The voice gone, leaving only the memory of it, etched into his mind like a scar. He lowered the rifle slowly. The cold had seeped into his bones, his body trembling from more than just the chill. Keep moving, he thought, his legs heavy as lead. Just keep moving. The base's lights were a faint glow in the distance now, a beacon of safety that seemed impossibly far away. Torres forced his feet forward, each step a battle against the crushing weight of the night. The voice was gone, but its presence lingered. A malevolent shadow that clung to him as he trudged through the desert. And somewhere, out there in the darkness, he knew it was still watching. The wind howled through the desolate expanse, a mournful cry that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. Corporal Ray Torres stumbled forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the cold desert air bit at his skin. The base lights, once a distant glimmer of hope, had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. He was alone, stranded in the vast emptiness, with only his thoughts, and something far more sinister, to keep him company. He wasn't sure when he first noticed it. Perhaps it was the way the shadows shifted, or the subtle change in the air, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. But when he turned, rifle clutched tightly in his hands, the figure was there again. Closer, this time. It stood at the edge of the flashlight's reach, a dark silhouette against the night, its form grotesque and unnatural. Torres froze, his heart pounding in his chest, eyes straining to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was human-shaped but wrong, its limbs too long, its posture hunched and twisted, like a marionette with broken strings. The light caught its eyes, and they gleamed with a sickly, unnatural glow, a cold fire that sent shivers down his spine. He took a step back, breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, but there was a sense of coiled energy, a tension in the air, as if it could spring forward at any moment. Torres raised his rifle, finger hovering over the trigger. But something held him back, a deep, primal fear that warned him against pulling that trigger, as if the act itself would unleash something far worse than what he was already facing. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the vast emptiness around him. The figure remained silent, its eyes locked onto his, unblinking and predatory. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, stronger now, more pungent. It twisted his stomach, a wave of nausea washing over him as the bile rose in his throat. His grip tightened on the rifle, sweat slicking his palms, despite the biting cold. Then the figure moved, just a twitch, a subtle shift in its stance, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through him. Torres flinched, the beam of his flashlight wavering as he tried to keep it steady. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being forced into motion. "Stay back!" Torres's shout was more desperate than commanding, and he took another step backward, his boots sinking into the loose sand. The figure paused, as if considering his words, and then it spoke, not in a voice, but in a sound, a horrible mimicry of his own voice, distorted and twisted.
"Stay back!"
It echoed, the words garbled, as if coming from a broken radio. The tone was wrong, the cadence off, as if it were learning how to speak for the first time. Torres's blood ran cold, the reality of what he was facing sinking in. This wasn't a person. It was something else. Something ancient and malevolent, wearing the guise of humanity like a cheap costume. His mind raced. The stories he'd heard in passing, the legends whispered around campfires, coming back to him now with chilling clarity. A skinwalker. The thought lodged itself in his brain, refusing to be dislodged. The creature was a legend, a myth from the old stories. Yet here it was, standing before him, a nightmare made flesh. Torres swallowed hard, forcing himself to think, to move, but his legs felt rooted to the spot, as if the desert itself had turned against him. The skinwalker stepped closer, and as it did, its form began to shift, the twisted silhouette melting and reforming like wax under a flame. Torres watched in horror as it morphed into something else, someone else. The long limbs shortened, the hunched posture straightened, and before his eyes, the creature took on a new form, one that was all too familiar. It was Private First Class Carter, one of the soldiers from his unit, who had died months ago in an ambush. But it wasn't just Carter. There was something off about the figure, a wrongness that made Torres's stomach churn. The eyes, still glowing with that unnatural light, stared at him with a knowing, cruel gaze. And the smile that stretched across its face was too wide, too sharp.
"Torres,
It said in Carter's voice, but the tone was mocking, twisted.
you're not looking so good, buddy."
He staggered back, the rifle trembling in his hands. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the sand beneath his feet, the cold air biting at his skin, the stench of decay, everything was too vivid, too sharp to be a mere hallucination. The skinwalker advanced, and with each step, it shifted again. Carter's form melted away, replaced by another. His mother, her kind eyes now hollow and dead, her face contorted into a grotesque parody of love. Torres shook his head violently, his grip on reality slipping with every passing second. The desert around him began to warp, the ground shifting beneath his feet, the distant mountains bending and twisting like the surface of a funhouse mirror. The stars in the sky blurred, and the air grew thick, suffocating, as if the night itself was closing in on him. He stumbled, nearly falling, as the skinwalker shifted once more. This time, it took on his own form, an exact replica down to the uniform, the rifle, even the fear etched into his features. It grinned at him, the expression grotesque and malevolent, the eyes burning with that sickly light.
"What are you afraid of?"
It asked in his own voice, the words dripping with mockery.
"It's just you out here. Just you. All alone."
Torres's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he tried to focus, tried to remember what was real and what wasn't. But the lines were blurring, his mind unraveling under the pressure. The skinwalker began to circle him, its movements fluid and predatory, like a wolf stalking its prey. With each pass, the landscape around him distorted further, rocks growing tall and jagged like the teeth of some ancient beast. The ground beneath him shifting and cracking as if ready to swallow him whole. He raised his rifle, aiming at the creature that now wore his face, his finger trembling on the trigger. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself, a desperate mantra. "It's not real." The skinwalker stopped, its eyes locking onto his, and for a moment, the world fell silent. The wind died, the shifting sand stilled, and all that remained was the two of them, locked in a deadly standoff.
"But what if it is?"
The creature asked, its voice soft, coaxing.
What if this is your reality now? What if you never escape?
Torres's resolve wavered, the rifle shaking in his hands as the weight of those words settled over him. What if it was right? What if this nightmare was his new reality? The lines between truth and illusion forever blurred. The Skinwalker smiled again, sensing his doubt, and began to change once more. It became his father, his best friend from basic training, the first girl he'd ever loved, all of them wearing that same cruel grin, their eyes blazing with the fire of the desert night. Torres's mind screamed at him to run, to flee this place and never look back. But his body wouldn't obey, rooted in place by terror and confusion. He was trapped, caught in a nightmare that had no end, no escape. And as the Skinwalker took on his form once more, its voice echoing in his mind, he knew one thing for certain. Whether he lived or died out here in the desert, a part of him would never leave this place. It would remain twisted and broken, just like the thing that now stood before him.
What are you waiting for?
It whispered, its voice merging with the wind, the earth, the very air around him.
Pull the trigger.
But Torres couldn't. His fingers wouldn't move, his mind unable to make the decision. The Skinwalker grinned wider, its teeth sharp as knives, and stepped closer until there was no space left between them.
You'll never escape,
it whispered. And this time, it wasn't just his voice. It was all the voices, merging into one, a cacophony of torment that filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts. The desert closed in around him, the sky above twisting into an inky black void, and Torres knew he had lost. Whether it was to the Skinwalker or to his own crumbling sanity, he wasn't sure. But in that moment, as the creature reached out to him, he knew one thing. He was no longer alone. The night dragged on, a dark and endless sea of shadows that stretched across the desert, swallowing everything in its path. Corporal Ray Torres was barely holding on, his mind teetering on the edge of madness as the Skinwalker circled closer, its presence a constant weight pressing down on his sanity. The landscape around him had long since lost its familiarity, twisting into something unrecognizable, a grotesque caricature of the world he once knew. Dawn was approaching, but the horizon remained stubbornly dark, the first hints of light refusing to break through the oppressive gloom. Torres knew that the creature was toying with him, bending time and space to its will, dragging out the hours to prolong his suffering. But he also knew that it was getting closer, its hunger growing with every passing moment. He could feel it in the air, a charged tension, like the moments before a storm unleashes its fury. His breath was shallow, each inhalation a struggle against the terror that threatened to choke him. The rifle in his hands was no longer a comfort, but a burden, its weight a reminder of how little it could do against the nightmare stalking him. He had to think, had to find a way to survive. But his mind was a fractured mess, every thought drowned out by the creature's relentless whispering.
You're weak.
It hissed from the darkness, the voice slithering into his ear like a serpent.
You always were. That's why they left you.
Torres clenched his jaw, forcing the voice aside, focusing on the task at hand. He wasn't going to die out here, not like this. His training had taught him to survive, to outthink his enemies, and this was no different. The Skinwalker was playing a game, but so could he. The plan began to form in his mind, born out of desperation and the knowledge that he had nothing left to lose. He reached down, pulling the combat knife from its sheath, the blade catching the faintest glimmer of light from the flashlight. His hands shook as he brought the blade to his forearm, the edge biting into his skin with a sharp sting. Blood welled up, dark and warm, dripping onto the sand below. The Skinwalker's presence intensified, the air thickening with its anticipation. Torres could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. He gritted his teeth, carving a shallow line across his arm, the pain grounding him in the moment, keeping his mind from splintering apart.
What are you doing?
The voice was closer now, curious, laced with a hint of unease. The creature was unsure, thrown off by his sudden act of defiance. Torres didn't answer. Instead, he moved quickly, drawing another line, deeper this time, letting the blood flow freely. He could feel the creature's gaze fixated on him, drawn to the scent, the promise of what it desired most. He wasn't just baiting it. He was daring it to come closer. The Skinwalker didn't disappoint. The air around him grew colder, the darkness thickening as the creature began to manifest fully. The landscape twisted and warped, the sand beneath his feet shifting like the surface of a liquid. But Torres held his ground, his eyes locked on the spot where he knew it would appear.
You think you can trick me?
The voice was filled with derision now, but there was an undercurrent of doubt. The creature was powerful, ancient, but it wasn't infallible. It had underestimated him, dismissed him as just another frightened human to toy with before the kill. Torres crouched low, pressing his bleeding arm to the ground, smearing the sand with his blood. The pain was sharp, a reminder that he was still alive, still fighting. He could see the faint outline of the Skinwalker. Now, its form shifting and indistinct. A mass of shadows and malevolence that defied description. The creature hesitated, its form flickering between shapes. His father, his mother, his own reflection. Each one distorted, twisted into something grotesque and wrong. It was trying to find a weakness, a crack in his resolve that it could exploit. But Torres kept his mind focused, refusing to let it break him.
You're nothing.
The Skinwalker spat, its voice seething with anger.
Just a scared little boy playing soldier.
Torres didn't flinch, didn't give it the satisfaction of a reaction. He kept his eyes on the creature, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for the right moment. The sun was creeping toward the horizon now. The first faint glimmers of light bleeding into the sky. But he knew it wouldn't be enough to stop the creature. He had to do it himself. The Skinwalker lunged, its form solidifying as it closed the distance between them, its eyes burning with a sickly green fire. Torres tensed, his muscles coiled, ready to spring. The creature's hands, twisted and clawed, reached out for him, and in that instant, Torres made his move. With a burst of speed, he leaped to the side, rolling across the sand as the Skinwalker's claws raked the air where he had been. He came up on one knee, the rifle raised, and fired. The shot echoed through the desert, a sharp crack that shattered the stillness. The bullet struck the Skinwalker square in the chest, but it didn't falter. Instead, it let out a howl of rage, a sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. Torres didn't hesitate, didn't stop to think. He sprang to his feet, charging toward the creature even as it recovered from the blow. The Skinwalker turned, its eyes locking onto him with a look of pure hatred. It lashed out, its claws cutting through the air, but Torres was ready. He ducked under the swipe, bringing the knife up in a quick, brutal arc. The blade bit into the creature's side, slicing through its flesh with a wet, sickening sound. The Skinwalker screamed, a high-pitched, keening wail that reverberated through the desert, a sound of pure agony. It staggered back, its form flickering and distorting, unable to maintain its shape. Torres pressed the advantage, driving the knife into its chest with all the strength he had left. The creature convulsed, its body spasming as it tried to shift, to escape. But Torres held on, twisting the blade deeper. His teeth gritted against the pain that radiated from his wounded arm. Blood, dark and thick, poured from the Skinwalker's wounds, staining the sand beneath them. "You're done," Torres snarled, his voice raw and filled with fury. "This ends now." The Skinwalker let out one final, desperate scream, its body convulsing violently. For a moment, it seemed as though it might overpower him, but then, with a shuddering gasp, it collapsed, its body disintegrating into a pile of ash and shadow. Torres stumbled back, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The sun was rising now, the first rays of light spilling over the horizon, bathing the desert in a warm, golden glow. The darkness was retreating, the nightmare finally over. But as he stood there, his bloodied hands clutching the knife, he realized something was wrong. The ground beneath him was shifting, the sand moving as if alive. He looked down, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the shadows coalescing, reforming, the ash swirling back into the shape of the Skinwalker. "No," he whispered. the word barely escaping his lips as the creature rose from the ground, its form solidifying once more. It was weakened, its body flickering like a dying flame, but it was still there, still hungry. Torres backed away, his mind racing. He had given everything, put all his strength into that final attack, and it hadn't been enough. The Skinwalker was too powerful, too ancient to be killed by mortal means. The creature grinned, its eyes burning with that sickly green fire.
You're mine.
It hissed, its voice a rasping whisper that sent chills down his spine. He turned and ran, his legs heavy, every step a struggle against the sand that seemed to cling to his boots. The creature followed, its laughter echoing through the desert, a cruel, mocking sound that drove him forward faster and faster. But he couldn't outrun it. No matter how fast he moved, no matter how far he ran, the Skinwalker was always there, just behind him, its presence a constant, oppressive weight on his mind. His vision blurred, the landscape twisting and warping around him, the desert a nightmare maze with no escape. And then, in a moment of pure, unthinking terror, he tripped, the sand shifting beneath his feet as he fell to the ground. He tried to get up, tried to force his body to move, but it was too late. The Skinwalker was on him, its claws digging into his flesh, its eyes burning with triumph. Torres screamed, a sound of pure, unbridled fear, as the creature's teeth sank into his neck, the pain blinding, overwhelming. The desert spun around him, the sky darkening as the sun was swallowed by the shadows. His mind shattered, his thoughts consumed by the agony that ripped through him. And as the Skinwalker claimed him, as his screams echoed through the empty desert, he knew that he was lost. Body, mind, and soul, all consumed by the darkness.